Welcome back to Table Stakes. We're once again joined by Veerless senior consultant, Kris Fischer. Welcome back, Kris. Glad to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here again.
When did we do this last? Last fall, right? I'm a bad podcaster.
Yeah, I think it was September or October time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Maybe it was then.
incredibly excited to have this conversation today. We've been talking about it for a while because that's my MO in podcasting. Talk about something for 6 months and then finally record. So I'm trying to get better at that, and our team is pushing me forward. And we are doing our first video recorded podcast today as well, which is also nerve-wracking. Like, hello.
Oh,
Um, Very nerve-wracking, but Courtney, our new assistant who is doing all of our social media, says that we have to do it. So we're listening to Courtney. I am in my house by myself today. Charlie is not here, and I have dogs around. So if you hear dogs crying and barking, that's, it is what it is. And you're with your dogs too. So
I will have the same issue. Yes.
we might have dog noise today, but that's okay. So for our listeners, today we're kicking off a discussion that we intend to use throughout the year and that we intend to visit throughout the year because I think the the scope of this discussion is so huge and so big that we have a lot to talk about related to it. And it has been called, and this is language that you had found, Kris, the silent sabotage of workplace well-being. Kris is an expert in this concept, which has been called moral distress in industries around the world. And what we're going to do today is lay out the framework of moral distress, talk about its comparisons and differences to ethical decision making. And then throughout the year, we're going to come back to this topic because moral distress applies in a lot of organizations, in a lot of different industries, in a lot of different job types. It applies in corporate decision making. It applies in how sustainability professionals experience burnout that might be caused in part by moral distress in their workplace. So let's start with this podcast by kind of defining some of the basics and really thinking this through so that everybody has an understanding of where we're starting. So, Kris, give us the basics of moral distress. Like, where did this concept originate? Who did it come from? Kind of what does it mean?
Yeah. So I'm really excited to talk about this. And I find that every time I dive into it, I learn more about how applicable it is across industries, across careers. But really, the term moral distress, the phenomenon of it is, you know, worldwide, but the term got its start in the nursing literature because researchers were noticing that nurses specifically were leaving the profession. And it seemed like it was about more than just burnout. Burnout is bad enough, but it seemed like there was another layer to it. So in the 1980s, ethicist Andrew Jameton coined the term moral distress because nurses had shared with him the difficulties that they had providing the care that they felt they should provide when something got in their way. So the very basic definition of moral distress is when you feel like you know what the right thing is to do, you know what action you feel like you should take, but something gets in the way, either inside you or in your external environment, that keeps you from doing it. And then that's that angst that develops from there.
So it builds up, really. It's not a one-time distress. It's an ongoing and building distress.
Yeah, both and. I mean, you can experience it one time, but in most workplaces, it's not a one and done. And the impact of it continues to build because we're not really good about recognizing it and then debriefing it and working through it and processing it. And so what comes with us from the previous experience adds up and piles on. And then the next time we come up against something that's challenging and we feel like we can't do the right thing, we're carrying with us that baggage from the time before. And over time, as that adds up and builds up, people just get to the point where they're like, I just can't do this anymore. It's too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Give us some examples of how this plays out in the nursing field. I mean, that's sort of where this started. So, what have been some of the traditional examples?
Sure. So, for bedside nursing, for example, if the medical team has some thoughts about the route that the care should go, maybe it's a situation where a patient's prognosis is really poor. And it feels like all of the additional interventions that we're doing are really not providing help. They're not making things better. In some cases, it might feel like they're making things worse. They're causing pain. And they've had conversations with the family to say, maybe we need to take another approach. Maybe we need to look at palliative care. And for whatever reasons, usually there are really good reasons in their minds, the family can't quite get on board with that. So nurses come to work every day to work with this patient and feel like, I know what I feel like I should do to care holistically in the best way for this patient, but I can't do it. That's one of the examples that we see a lot in my work on our ethics committee that we come across a lot. Or sometimes it's that maybe hospital policy or procedures prevent them from working in the way they need to. Most recently, a lot of what we've seen is we know a lot of nurses have left the field, especially since the pandemic, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more. And so they have more work to do with fewer people to do it. And so they feel like they can't provide adequate care because they have to try to be three places at once and they just can't. And that feeling of not being able to do the work that you feel you should do because the environment around you is what causes that distress.
Well, it's funny. So I know that medical professionals' jobs are not accurately portrayed on television, but and I'll tell our listeners, my husband and I have been binge watching Chicago Med, and you have told me you think they do a pretty good job on that one. Like,
I mean, it's better than some. If you were to rate them on a Likert scale, it's probably closer to a 3 or 4 than some. Yeah.
But it's interesting because they just got to the COVID years. Like we've been binging. So this show's been on for a long time and they actually just got to the COVID years. And the example was during COVID, and I looked this up last night, and this was actually a real protocol that if someone went into cardiac arrest, you couldn't do chest compressions because it spread too much virus. So they could shock a person but at the sort of early onset of COVID, they didn't know what they could do and what they couldn't do. And there was a scene in Chicago Med of a nurse screaming, let me do chest compressions, let me do chest compressions. And I'm saying, that's not our protocol. We can't, that's not the COVID protocol right now. And I just can't even imagine when the Hippocratic oath, right? Of you have to do everything you can to save a patient. And you actually, in some cases, can't.
It was, I
It's awful.
worked in the hospital during the peak of COVID, and it was so hard for staff and not just nurses. Moral distress impacts all disciplines in healthcare in different ways, but during COVID, like the respiratory therapists and the physicians and the people who had to completely head to toe personal protective equipment to go into rooms with patients, and their families couldn't be there because we couldn't allow visitors during those time periods. And people were dying alone, and that's not okay. And so many of those things that made being able to provide care to the standard that we're used to just impossible. It was so hard because people had instincts, like you said, of what they wanted to do to care for their patients, and we just couldn't. It was awful. And I think that we haven't probably done a great job. I know we haven't. Research shows we haven't done a great job of really processing what that meant and how that impacted us, and the trauma that stays from that carries on to the care that we provide patients now that the pandemic has settled down a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, we're talking about in some cases, some of the worst degrees of moral stress that you're dealing with life and death in a hospital setting. And I think what we want to do this year as we talk about this topic consistently is break it down beyond that. I mean, those are incredibly important pieces. But here's something I've questioned. So I've heard you talk about moral distress for a number of years. You give presentations about this all over the country, and especially in the context of the pandemic and the medical field. But I'll admit, I've even struggled to understand the differences between what is called moral distress and this kind of concept of moral distress that, like you said, has been around from Andrew Jameton since 1984, and the idea of ethical distress. So I've read, coming from the corporate sector, a lot of traditional ethics books like Mark Godwin and Peter Singer, and I'll link a few of those in our show notes. And I'll also link, I found this Venn diagram, which, Google image search of the differences between morals and ethics. Of like, there's this middle Venn diagram of like right and wrong content and or conduct, and then on morals are sort of personal principles that don't change, where ethics are ethical rules. Is that the right way to think about this? How do you think about the difference between moral distress and an ethical dilemma?
Well, some of it's a little bit of an academic difference or a difference without a distinction or however that goes. But for the most part, the difference is that when you're experiencing an ethical dilemma, and this is true across the board, not just in healthcare, the dilemma comes from I can't figure out what the right thing to do is. I'm stuck in this situation, and either two things feel right, and I'm not sure which is most right, or everything feels wrong, and I'm not sure which is the best of the worst. And so, using an ethical framework or decision making to try to work through those options to determine which is the most ethical course of action. And that's usually what we think of when we think of an ethical dilemma. With moral distress, there's a lot of overlap, because what distinguishes moral distress from just psychological distress is that there's that moral component that we feel like somehow our values are compromised, right? So with moral distress, typically, by definition, we've figured out the ethical course of action. So if there was an ethical dilemma, we probably worked through it already and made the determination what we feel like the right answer is, but we can't do it. So we're caught in kind of that quagmire of now I know what to do, but I can't launch because something's keeping me from doing it. In
Uh,
reality, in practice, they can happen together. They can coexist. They're not mutually dependent on each other, but they can coexist. So you can have difficulty deciding what to do and struggling with what you are doing in the meantime because it doesn't feel right, and then figure out what you feel like you should be doing and still not be able to carry it out. And it's that angst that comes with.
Well, it's the traditional, right? So if you take a like ethics 101 class in college, right? The first thing they teach you is the, train barreling at one person on the tracks, and if you flip the switch, the train would hit, or train barreling at four people on the tracks, and if you hit the switch, it hits one person. There's no way to stop the train, right? It's one of those quote unquote easy like ethical decisions. Of course, you flip the switch to kill one person's instead of four, right? But then they go further, right? Like, what if the one is a baby and the four are like, there's all these
Right.
determinations. But no matter what that decision is, the distress after that decision is moral distress. Is that a good way to think of it, or am I simplifying
Yeah,
it?
in some ways, because either way, whatever you're doing doesn't feel like you're actually doing right.
Right.
So it can happen. Generally, there's other ethical issues going on when moral distress occurs as well, but the distress is that experience of I know it feels like the right thing to do here, or I see a wrong happening. And it can be, on the negative as well. I see a wrong happening by somebody else, or I'm being asked to do something wrong, and I either can't stop it or I don't know what to do about it. So, like moving beyond the healthcare setting, that can happen lots of places. If you find that you're being asked to do something by your boss that just doesn't feel right, or you're being prohibited from doing what's supposed to be right because of the policies or the requests of your supervisors and those above you, can
Well, I mean,
bring about
what
that feeling.
immediately comes to mind too is something like reduction in force, right? Being asked to say, well, okay, you need to reduce your staff by $300,000. Do you take the head count of one bigwig, or do you take the head count of five, lower level folks? And how do you make that decision? Or, if you're working in ESG, which I want to dive deeper into because I do think moral distress is a consistent issue in our field. And I think burnout is a consistent issue in our field. But we encounter these questions every day of, I only have $100,000 budget to do one thing. Should I do, should I buy software that helps me better calculate, or should I work on getting things done on the ground? And those were things, I confronted these topics all the time, when it's like, which side do you work on, reporting or do you work on doing? Do you work on going forward or do you work on transparency? Like, which sides do you sort of do? And that consistent feeling of angst, like you said, is the distress that we're talking about.
Right. And when I talk with groups about moral distress, it can feel really distressing just to talk about it. Like, oh my gosh, this is so awful and there's nothing that can be done. And it, in some ways it's true, depending on the setting that you work in, it's kind of hard to avoid, especially when we're working with humans who have free will and make their own decisions and are often in stressful situations. But the important thing to recognize about moral distress is that it can lead to resilience if you address it and have kind of a thoughtful approach to working through it. If it's not seen so much as a failure, but as an opportunity, when you notice, when you recognize you're starting to experience moral distress, to say, okay, this is awful. I'm not doing well with this right now. Given that, how can I, kind of assess what I'm going through and why, and what are my opportunities here to maybe mitigate it this time and moving forward?
So that brings up an interesting question of how does someone know when they're experiencing true moral distress versus just being, I don't know, ticked off with an outcome, right? Like my
Right.
boss asked this thing and I disagree with them, right? I think we should do this in PowerPoint instead of Excel, right?
Right.
Like so how do you know when the feeling is real and distressing and that sort of moral distress feeling versus just I disagree or this isn't what I think we should do?
Right. And those are valid feelings as well, but they don't generally lead to the long-term um, sequelae or even causing people to leave their jobs or leave their field in the same way that moral distress does that. And
Yeah.
so, in a practical way, the way that we help, I help lead education for nurse residents at the hospital that I work with. And what we help them understand is, when you notice that you feel like you're not doing something right or you can't do what's right, when you're taking it home with you at night, when you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep because it's on your heart, when you get up and you're ready to go to work the next day, you'll face that same situation and you just feel really hesitant to take that step out the door because you know how it's going to be. I used to work with a lovely chaplain, Sister Julie, and she'd say, you're facing an ethical dilemma or moral distress when your guts are churning, when that's just that internal, like, or as a very, very dear friend of mine who's a physician says, when your conscience isn't clear, when it's heavier on your heart than just, I just feel ticked off. But if I went for a walk and, watched my favorite Hallmark movie, I'd feel better. It
Mm.
sits with you because it goes to the core of your own values. And it feels like you're going against what feels right within the core of yourself.
It's interesting. One of my favorite corporate leaders of all time, I don't always agree with her politically, but is Carly Fiorina, who was the CEO, first female CEO of HP, one of the really first female CEOs in the Fortune 500. And she wrote a book after her time at HP. And she said that once a year, she takes time away and really reflects on the year prior. And the question she asks herself is my soul still my own? And I remember I've read her book a bunch of times. It's funny, I met her in Chicago. She did a speech. I think it was for Chicago Council on Global Affairs one time. And I met her and I brought my book for her to sign. And she said it was the most used version of her book she ever signed. And I was like, oh yeah, I've read your book a good 10 times. But I read her book right after I left my last corporate job. And that chapter where she talked about is my soul still my own? Um, it shook me because I think that was, um, without saying too much negativity about my former employer, which that's not what it was about. It was, have you sold your soul for the corporate job? Have you sold your soul for their betterment and not your own? Have you threatened your own integrity and have you gone down those roads? And I had to encounter, and I think a lot of people in our field have at some time had to encounter that yes, we have sold our souls for the job and for the money or for the title or whatever that looks like. And that's been something that you and I and our team at Veerless have worked really hard to never do and to be very careful about who we work with and why we work with them. But, it's that same sort of thing of check in with yourself, not just on the day it hurts, but quarterly and annually to go, like you said, are my guts churning on a daily basis, or is my conscience clear? And I think that's important no matter what your job is, right?
Right, absolutely. And you really hit on the key. It can escalate and take on different forms, kind of like a snowball rolling downhill, but really at the end of the day, it threatens your integrity. And as a human, we can't continue to do the same thing over and over when our personal integrity is threatened. And what that also does, because it's pretty unusual, especially in healthcare, but probably true in the rest of the workforce as well, that it's typically not an isolated experience. It's just that we don't talk about it. So it's not unusual that others on a team or others that work on your unit or, whatever your workplace looks like are experiencing it too, maybe to a different degree, maybe in a little bit different way, but generally it's not an isolated experience, and that can threaten team dynamics. It can threaten productivity because everybody's feeling pretty weighed down. In healthcare, it can end up affecting patient safety, but that could be true with workplace safety, physical and psychological safety. If everybody's burdened and weighed down by the sense of moral distress and nobody's addressing it, and everybody in their integrity is threatened, eventually you can't all collectively do the work appropriately. And that's why it's so incumbent on people to be able to raise their
Mhm.
hand and lift their voice and say, hey, I'm going through this. Maybe you are too. What can we do? Let's talk about this. Let's look at ways that we can have a safe culture where when we start to feel like things aren't going well, that we can talk about it. And we have that space to say, this place we work, the culture where we work, accepts that sometimes things aren't great. And then we stop and we check ourselves and we change course if we need to, so we can get back on track and have a healthy environment.
So we'll talk about this more in the corporate sector, but in the healthcare sector, I mean, how does an administrator admit to themselves and to their organization that there's moral distress happening in their ranks? I mean, I see the lawyer hat going on of like, well, we can't say that we made them make terrible ethical decisions, right? Like, how can you address that I mean, I know you guys are doing this in hospital settings with the groups that you work with, but how can you address that internally without sort of running the risk of identifying everything that's bad and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or whatever, adage you want to put in there?
Well, we're fortunate in healthcare that JCO and the other regulatory bodies recognize that hard stuff happens because of the nature of the environment that we're in. Technology has far outpaced our ability to figure out what to do about things. And
Mhm.
so ethical dilemmas and moral conundrums come up. JCO requires that health systems of a certain size have an ethics committee or access to one because they recognize difficult things happen. But on a place by place basis, I think it's really just helping people to understand that you can't work in a situation like this with humans, often with end of life situations, when people are emotionally heightened and not have moral distress occur. So to kind of flip the narrative that it's not actually a failure when you start to experience it, it could end up being a problem and a failure when you don't acknowledge it and you don't address it. And so to have that culture that gives permission to say, we are experiencing difficulty right now. I was in a situation as part of our hospital ethics committee. A couple of us are deployed to different teams that are experiencing moral distress, and we do debriefs and we help them work through the situation that they're in. And more often than not, we find that there's workflow issues or policy issues or
Mhm.
something else at that middle or higher level, systemic issues that kind of lead us to getting to that situation over and over and over again. And it gives us the opportunity to take that 30,000-foot view and say, hey, this keeps happening to some extent or another, but what if we look at what's happening within the system that lends it to this to happen? How can we maybe tweak our policies and our processes or our workflows so that this is less likely to happen? And how can we create a culture that's transparent and gives permission and says, please do bring this up. It's the best for our workforce, and in healthcare, it's the best for our patient outcomes. It's really an effort for patient safety and quality. It's part of a good
Yeah.
quality program to address moral distress and to accept that it does happen. What's not acceptable is to brush it under the rug.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to go back to something that you said, um, because I don't know that everybody will know. JCO, Kris, what's JCO? And regulators are good things? We hate regulation.
Well, as scary as it is when you hear the overhead page saying, we would like to welcome the Joint Commission today. It's the Joint Commission on Healthcare Accreditation, and soup to nuts, they look at everything that healthcare systems, primarily hospital systems, do to provide care to patients every day. And there's many, many multitudes of things that they look at, from the very basic things about the equipment that we have, the workplace environment, physical safety, emotional safety, training, all of those things to make sure that we are best equipped as a workforce and as an institution to provide the very best and safest care so that our patients have good outcomes.
So it's funny, it's March 18th. On Friday, the first of the major lawsuits blocking the SEC climate rule came out, right? And they're literally going to run a lottery to determine which court system gets to rule on all of these things, which
Lucky
is
them.
lucky Fifth Circuit or whoever ends up getting it. But it's the interesting, I think the comparison is fair because there is this major pushback on the SEC right now on the climate rule of, hey guys, stay in your lane. You're the finance regulators. Get out of our crap. We don't want you in climate. You don't have any reason to do this. And then you look at something like healthcare and you look at healthcare 30 years ago, right? And there weren't the kinds of checks in place that there are now. And now JCO has these ethics regulations. JCO has a sustainability certification.
They do. It's brand new. They have a health equity certification. I mean, JCO is kind of getting into the sustainability lane, recognizing that healthcare is one of the biggest offenders to carbon production. So yeah, it's not exclusive
Healthcare,
to any one area,
call us. We can help you with your JCO sustainability certification. No, I'm kidding.
right?
No, shameless plug. But it's interesting. I mean, I think again, this is an opportunity to see where in some cases, and JCO, I think is a fantastic example of how a regulator has led major systems down this route of saying, we've identified a problem inside your industry. We're going to help you figure out how to solve it. And we have some processes that we think you can put in place. And moral distress and ethical dilemma is just one of those places that it's good to see healthcare moving that direction, but they didn't do it because they wanted to necessarily. They did it because somebody pushed, right? And I think
Right.
it's
Somebody
an
pushed
interesting thought.
and we are losing the workforce, and we have to find a way to keep our workforce in
Right.
healthcare, outside of healthcare, healthy and able to keep doing the jobs that they do and stop burning them out in multiple ways and setting them up for failure and threats to their integrity with unaddressed moral distress.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of research addressing moral distress, as you said, in this field, more research being done in other disciplines as well. We are going to talk about this throughout the year. I think this was a great conversation to kick us off, and would love our listeners to tell us what they want to hear about ethical dilemmas, about moral distress, where are places you see it showing up for you. But I think, as Kris has just highlighted, healthcare is a great place to learn from and to see where this is happening. But I think we can all see where this extends everywhere. And I love that what you had given me the thing at the silent sabotage of workplace well-being. And we see it with our clients, right? Everybody is developing well-being programs, but are we thinking through what these kinds of decisions ongoing do to our people in the long run?
Right. ultimately, we can have the best benefits program. We can have a yoga studio in the basement. We can have free concert tickets. But if we don't take care of our employees' souls, of their integrity, then we're not going to be able to keep them healthy and functioning in the workforce.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things I want to talk about. I'm so excited. Like, Google, don't be evil, right? They took that away at some point, but it's like all the free food in the world doesn't help if, what are you doing? So, oh, there's so much to talk about with this. So, we will keep this conversation going. Kris, as always, thanks for being a part of our incredible Veerless team, and thanks for joining me on the podcast.
I've been delighted to have this conversation with you, and I look forward to the next one.